Right. So we left off with talking about explanations or categories rather of those in poverty, right? So now we want to talk about why is it that the poor are poor? And this is a topic that tends to be controversial because it kind of comes down to this debate between whether poverty or finding yourself in a difficult social situation um, or not being able to attain social well-being, whether that's an individual problem. In other words, it's my personal fault. There's something that I did wrong, or that I'm unable to do, or does it have to do with broader economic um, issues, or does it have to do with the way that we've made policies, right? And so explanations and debates about why people find themselves in poverty or in an inability to participate in society and the economy, um, those explanations fall into roughly three categories, right? So the first one, and probably the more controversial, the most controversial of the three, are social and cultural explanations, right? Um, this is the idea that the poor are different from the rest of society, and that poverty and poverty traits are transmitted intergenerationally in some kind of self-perpetuating cycle, right? Now, when I say transmitted intergenerationally, I don't mean through DNA. That would be social Darwinism, and we all know that that is crazy. What I mean is that it is transmitted intergenerationally through socialization and through social isolation, right? So when we talk about that, often we talk about what's called the culture of poverty thesis, right? That people who live in poverty, they become characterized by hopelessness, indifference, alienation, apathy, that they have a lack of effective participation in social and economic mainstream society. And that kind of hopelessness, right? This idea that you live in poverty, that's what you know, that's how you've been socialized, means that you can't figure out how to get out of it, right? Oftentimes that means that as an individual, you develop this kind of present tense time orientation. That's how the textbook characterizes it, and I kind of like that, meaning that what's happening in the immediate moment is the most important thing. You're worried about survival, period. So you can't think ahead. There's some cynicism and mistrust of those in authority. People in the culture of poverty begin to feel marginalized. They begin to feel helpless and inferior to others. And there's a lack of impulse control and an inability to defer gratification, again, because you're so worried about being in the moment and just getting what you need in the moment. There's also fatalism, right? This is the way it always has been. This is the way it's always going to be. There's nothing I can do about it. And therefore a high tolerance for kind of this psychological pathology. So you can see why this particular explanation, this particular culture of poverty thesis can be controversial because it places the blame on the poor themselves, right? That they are not psychologically tough enough, they're not resilient enough, they can't think past today in order to figure out how to pull themselves out of poverty, right? Add to this that some of these social and cultural explanations also lean heavily on the disintegration of traditional nuclear family structures, meaning the rise in single parenthood or divorce, right? And so, as we saw from our poverty statistics, it is true that families where there are two parents present certainly are not as poor. And we look at the fact that people who live alone as single individuals instead of in family structures also have significant poverty rates. That becomes part of the question too. And then, of course, we get into this debate about should government dictate traditional family values, right? And what is the value in that? So that's why this particular set of explanations is often the subject of political debate. Of course, the other social and cultural explanation, the other thing that falls under this is discrimination, right? That individuals are discriminated against. They're unable then to fully participate in society in the way that others are, and that holds them back as well. The second set of explanations are economic. And economic explanations kind of fall into some different categories as well. Of course, barriers to work, which we've already discussed, right? That you're not able to get to a job because you don't have transportation. Childcare is more expensive than it would be to just not work at all. In other words, if your childcare costs more than your income, that's a weird calculation to make. Substance abuse and mental health problems, some of the things we talked about already in categories of people who are poor. And of course, discrimination there as well, inability to get a job because you may have been discriminated against in hiring. Low productivity, this is our set of explanations that deal with human capital, individuals who may not have the skills and abilities that are valued in this particular workforce. So they don't have the right skills or training or the right education that's appropriate to the prevailing economy. Now, note, this doesn't mean that these individuals don't have some skills, right? It just means that they don't have the set of skills that are most valued in this particular economic structure. So this gets back to our change from our industrial economy to a service economy or a technology economy, right? Those individuals who used to work in steel mills or used to work in textile mills have a particular set of skills that maybe aren't valued and aren't appropriate to a tech economy, right? They either have to retrain or they have to find some kind of work that their skills are useful for, right? Low productivity tends to be the largest source of poverty in the United States, right? There's a skills mismatch. And of course, that's kind of a good thing because we know how to address that through education and training. Another set of economic explanations has to do with just the economic structure, right? So what type of economy do we have? And so I promised that we would go back to talk a little bit about different types of unemployment. This is where we get into these questions, right? Frictional unemployment, when we talk about economic structure, is when we just have a constantly changing economy. So these are jobs that come and go based on what's happening in the economy, whether we're in recession or inflation, whether there's an availability of capital for companies to hire more, or do they have to have layoffs or that sort of thing, right? Structural unemployment is quite different. Here we're talking about deep and long-lasting changes to the labor market, like those changes in technical skills required for new forms of work. So a transition from one type of economy to another type of economy. And cyclical unemployment is, kind of related to frictional unemployment, but also has to do just with people cycling in and out of the workforce for various reasons, okay? These distinctions are really important because, again, they may change how we approach unemployment insurance or how we approach job training or helping people to be successful in the workforce. And of course, the other economic explanation I think we've mentioned in class before is spatial mismatch, that you may have the skills in this economy, but the jobs are somewhere else, right? So let's say that you are sitting in Arizona and you are a great, auto person, automotive person, and all of the jobs in automotive factories are in Michigan or South Carolina or Alabama, right? Either you have to have the mobility and the ability to move to find that job, or your skills are just going to go to waste, okay? So spatial mismatch has to do more with macroeconomic policy and having localities attract jobs and states attract jobs that their workforce is trained for, okay? The other set of explanations for why the poor are poor are institutional explanations, and these are basically policy failures, right? In other words, we, policymakers, have made policies that contribute to the culture of poverty. We've made policies that contribute to barriers to work. We've made policies that contribute to spatial mismatch. So in government, we've actually passed laws or we've made policies that exacerbate these other explanations, right? It's our fault, right? There's policy failure. Just a couple of examples here to illustrate, and then I'll ask you for some examples too in a discussion question. Culture of poverty. Let's use that one first. One of the examples here is that in the post-war period, we built a lot of housing. We built a lot of subsidized housing because there was a lot of migration to cities, okay? And when we did that, particularly in crowded urban areas, we built public housing high-rises. And when we did that, what we really did was that we created islands of poverty. We moved a lot of people who had few resources all into one building, meaning that they're all in the same situation. They all have some lack of resources. And there's no social or professional networking opportunities in that residential community that's going to help you move out of that situation, right? Everybody's in the same boat. So in the 1990s and early 2000s, housing reform was really focused on breaking up these kind of islands of poverty, tearing down the high-rises, because what we realized was we had just created a poor community, period, right? That's a policy failure. It's a bad one. And we'll talk about that a little more when we get to housing in a few weeks. How have we contributed to spatial mismatch? Well, allowing localities to spend a lot of tax money to encourage particular types of businesses to locate in one place over another. That becomes an issue with spatial mismatch. There are a lot of examples. Again, I'm not going to give you any more. There's some good ones for barriers to work because I want you to give those to me in a discussion forum. Bottom line, in the language of social failure, the poor are poor because something keeps them from participating in a social or economic exchange that could have made them better off, right? Remember, in the first part of this lecture, we set that out, right? The poor are poor because something keeps them from participating in a social or economic exchange that could have made them better off. A social Pareto efficiency, right? One of the things, though, in the book really highlights this, so I'm not going to go into it too deeply, but one of the common themes in economic, social, and cultural and institutional explanations is discrimination, right? And that's one of the things that keeps or has kept many Americans from full social participation. In the book, again, does a really nice job of outlining forms of discrimination throughout history, and how that's affected different populations in the United States. And so I'm going to let you really focus on that in the reading, and then we'll have some discussion about it. But I do want to focus on the causes of discrimination because that is something that we can look at from a policy perspective, right? The first way to explain discrimination is through psychological explanations. So our friends in psychology and sociology have taught us that when individuals feel frustrated personally because they can't achieve their own potential, they often take that out on someone else, and there's some aggression there. So, for example, poor white Southerners often will take out that kind of frustration of not being able to get ahead on communities of color, right? Because they see them as an equivalent almost, but they don't want to be held equivalent to that other population, okay? And that's a classic sociological explanation or example. The second set of kind of what causes discrimination, normative and cultural explanations. In other words, this is how I was raised, right? This is how society is, and nobody's ever taught me any different. So that's a socialization explanation. And then finally, economic explanations really have to do with competition, right? the idea that when women entered the workforce, men all of a sudden had some competition in the workforce they didn't before, and there may have been and may still be some employment discrimination because it's an economic competitor, right? And you're discriminating on that basis. Of course, one last note, individual versus institutional discrimination, something we'll look at in other policy